The party was in full swing when Diana Voss decided to make an example of someone. It was the kind of gathering that Diana lived for. 40 guests in her marble-floored living room, the best catering company in the city working the floor, crystal glasses catching candlelight from every direction. Diana moved through the room like a woman who had rehearsed this exact version of her life since childhood. She smiled at the right people. She laughed at the right moments. She wore a dress that cost more than most people's monthly rent, and she wore it like armor, like proof, like a statement she had been waiting her whole life to make. She was reaching for a fresh glass of champagne when she saw it. Near the side table by the entrance, a tray of shrimp appetizers had been placed at a slight angle, one side marginally lower than the other, the garnish slightly disturbed as though someone had reached across it carelessly. It was a small thing, an almost invisible thing, but to Diana Voss, in a room full of people she needed to impress, it was a catastrophe. She set her glass down and crossed the room. Clara was standing near the kitchen doorway, 23 years old, 5 months into her position as Diana's household maid, holding a stack of clean napkins she had just finished folding. She had been working since 6 that morning. Setting up the furniture arrangement Diana had changed 3 times, pressing the tablecloths, polishing the glassware, arranging the fresh flowers that had been delivered at noon. She had not eaten since breakfast. Her feet ached. She had been careful and thorough and completely invisible in the way that good household staff learn to be, and she had believed foolishly that the evening was going smoothly. Diana stopped directly in front of her. "Would you like to explain?" Diana said, her voice carrying perfectly across the nearest cluster of guests. "What happened to the appetizer display?" Clara looked toward the table. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Voss. I'll fix it immediately." "You'll fix it," Diana repeated, with the particular inflection of someone repeating a phrase they find faintly ridiculous. "Clara, this is the 4th time this month that something has been wrong with your work. The 4th time I have had to come to you and point out something that should be obvious to anyone with basic competence." She turned slightly, just enough to ensure the nearby guests had a clear line of sight to the conversation. "I pay you to get these things right. Not almost right, not close enough. Right." Clara's face had gone pink. "I understand, Mrs. Voss. I'm very sorry. No." Diana held up one hand. "We're past apologies. I have guests in my home tonight. Important guests. People who expect a certain standard of environment, and you have repeatedly failed to meet that standard." She spoke the next words slowly and clearly, as though she wanted them to be heard and remembered. "You're fired. Collect your things from the service room and leave before the end of the hour. I'll have your final payment sent to the address we have on file." The guests who were close enough to hear had gone very still. Clara stood without moving for a moment. She did not argue. She did not cry, though her eyes were bright with the effort of not doing so. She placed the folded napkins carefully on the edge of the nearest table, smoothed the front of her uniform with both hands, and said quietly and with complete dignity, "I understand, Mrs. Voss. I'll leave my keys in the service room." She walked away without hurrying, her back straight, her chin level. Several guests watched her go. None of them said anything. Diana turned back to the room and smiled as though she had simply handled a minor administrative matter and was ready to return to more interesting things. A woman standing nearby, an old friend of Diana's named Patricia, caught Diana's eye and gave her a small, uncomfortable smile. The smile of someone who has just witnessed something they will be thinking about later, but isn't brave enough to say so now. Diana reached for her champagne and did not think about Clara again. Not that night. Not for a very long time. You are about to hear a story that people everywhere are sharing and talking about because it asks a question that none of us can afford to ignore. What kind of person do you become when no one who matters to you is watching? Where are you joining us from today? Perhaps New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, or Houston. Maybe London, Toronto, Melbourne, Lagos, Nairobi, or Dubai. Let us know in the comments below. Hit that like button to help this story reach someone who needs to hear it. Share it with a person in your life who has always been underestimated by someone who should have known better. Subscribe so you never miss a story that tells the truth about what dignity really looks like. Stay with us until the very end, because what happens between Diana Voss and the young woman she dismissed in front of 40 guests will teach you something about time and character that no business school in the world can offer. because life has a long memory, and it always finds a way to teach us the lessons we refuse to learn on our own. Diana Voss had not always been a woman who fired people at parties. She had learned it, the way people learn most of their cruelties. Slowly, incrementally, from watching others do it first and observing that nothing bad happened to them afterward. She had grown up the only daughter of a successful import business owner who had built his company from a warehouse operation into a regional enterprise over 30 years. Her father was a self-made man who spoke often and proudly about hard work and building from nothing, and who had, somewhere between building his business and raising his daughter, forgotten to teach her that the people who cleaned his offices and drove his cars and prepared his food were human beings rather than fixtures. Diana absorbed this without anyone ever saying it directly. She simply learned, over years of quiet observation, that certain people were invisible and certain people were not, and that the distinguishing factor was always money and never character. She had married well, which in her understanding meant she had married strategically. Her husband, Thomas Voss, was 15 years older than her, quietly wealthy, and content to leave the management of their social life entirely to Diana, who managed it with the same precision she brought to everything she believed mattered. She cultivated connections and curated impressions and worked the room at every event with the expertise of someone who had turned social navigation into a full-time occupation. She was not unintelligent. She was not without charm. She was simply a person who had decided long ago that the world was divided into useful people and irrelevant ones, and had never once questioned whether that decision said more about the world or about herself. Clara Reyes had not planned to become a maid. She had planned to become an architect. She had been 3 semesters into her degree at the city's second-largest university, carrying good grades, working part-time at a copy shop, mapping out a future with the careful and serious attention of someone who understood that no one was going to hand it to her. When her mother became ill, the illness was serious. The treatment was expensive. The insurance covered a portion, and the portion it left uncovered was more than Clara's family could manage. She took a leave of absence from university, telling herself it was temporary. She picked up extra shifts. She borrowed where she could. When the hospital bills continued to climb despite everything, she answered an advertisement for live-in household staff wages, which would allow her to send every other dollar home. She had come to the Voss household with her architecture textbooks in a bag and the quiet intention of studying in every spare hour. The spare hours were fewer than she had expected. Diana Voss ran a demanding household and had little interest in the inner lives of the people who maintained it. But Clara had continued to study when she could. Early mornings before the household woke, late nights after her duties were finished, because she had not given up on the future she was working toward. She had simply deferred it. The night Diana fired her in front of 40 guests, Clara packed her bag in the service room with steady hands. She found the keys and placed them in the label tray. She folded her uniform neatly, even though no one had asked her to. Then she took her architecture textbooks from the shelf where she had kept them and tucked them under her arm and walked out of the Voss household at 9:30 in the evening with nowhere immediately to go. She stood on the pavement outside for a moment, the night air cool on her face, and she allowed herself 30 seconds of feeling exactly how she felt. She was hurt. She was exhausted. She was frightened about what would come next. She gave herself 30 full seconds to feel all of it. And then she picked up her bag and started walking toward the bus stop because she had learned from her mother that the only direction worth moving in was forward. She thought on that walk about the folded napkins she had placed on the table before leaving. She did not know why she had done it. No one had asked her to. It was an automatic gesture, the kind of thing her hands did, because her hands had been trained in the discipline of doing things properly even when no one was watching. Even when the person watching had just demonstrated they did not deserve the care she was putting in. She had realized somewhere between the service room and the pavement that the folding of those napkins was perhaps the most important thing she had done all evening. Not important to Diana Voss, important to herself. A small private declaration about who she was and would continue to be regardless of how she had just been treated. She called her cousin that night. She slept on a couch. The next morning she was up at 6 looking for work. What Diana Voss never knew because she never thought to ask, because Clara had been a maid, and maids in Diana's understanding of the world did not have interior lives worth inquiring about, was that in the 5 months Clara had worked in that household, she had observed everything. Not with resentment, not with the calculating eye of someone plotting a return, but with the particular attentiveness of a person who has spent their whole life learning from every environment they pass through. She had watched how the household was managed. She had studied the vendors Diana used, the systems she relied on, the places where the management fell apart, and no one seemed to notice or care. She had filed it all away with the same methodical patience she applied to her architecture studies. She had been paying attention to more than Diana ever realized, and that attention would matter more than Diana could possibly have imagined on the night she sent her away. After leaving the Voss household, Clara spent 2 weeks staying with her cousin, taking any work she could find while she figured out the next step. On the 3rd week, she used part of her saved wages to register for a single continuing education course in project management. The one thing she had always believed her architecture training was missing. She studied at the kitchen table every evening after working a double shift at a cleaning company. Her cousin thought she was being too hard on herself. Clara thought she was being strategic. The cleaning company was called Meridian Services. It was a mid-sized operation, reasonably well run, but with a management structure that had not been updated in several years. Clara noticed this. She noticed the way the supply orders were duplicated every 3rd week because no one had mapped which teams were ordering from which vendors. She noticed the scheduling inefficiencies that sent crews to the north side of the city in the morning and back again in the afternoon, when a simple rerouting would have saved 2 hours of travel daily. She noticed the small frictions and redundancies that accumulate in any organization that is running on habit rather than intention, and she started quietly solving them. Not because it was her job, not because anyone asked her to, but because she was constitutionally incapable of seeing a problem she could fix and choosing not to fix it. Her supervisor noticed. The operations manager noticed. Within 8 months, she had been moved into a coordinator role. Within 14 months, she was running the residential division. The people who reported to her noticed something about the way she managed. She asked questions before giving instructions. She listened when people told her something wasn't working. She treated the cleaners and drivers and supply coordinators with the same straightforward respect she gave to the managers above her. This was not a strategy. It was simply who she was, shaped by years of knowing exactly what it felt like to be the person in the room who everyone else looked through. She enrolled back in university the following year, this time in a combined architecture and property development program, managing her studies around her work schedule with the same fierce discipline that had carried her through harder stretches than this. She graduated 3 years later, second in her class. Her thesis was on sustainable residential development in urban communities underserved by conventional construction firms. She had written the thesis in the evenings after work, at the same small kitchen table where she had studied for her coordinator exams, where she had mapped out her supply chain improvements for Meridian, where she had spent years quietly and methodically building towards something that the woman who fired her had been too careless to see coming. Every page of that thesis was written by someone who understood, from direct personal experience, what it meant to be overlooked by people with resources and how much that cost the communities those people never thought about. Her mother attended her graduation. She had recovered fully from her illness by then, and she sat in the audience in her best dress and watched her daughter walk across the stage. And afterwards, she held Clara's face in both hands and said nothing for a long moment, because there were no words adequate to what she was feeling. Clara held her mother's hands and understood that this moment was not just hers. It belonged to every early morning and 12-hour shift and 30-second pause on a pavement in the cold that had led to here. A property development company read her thesis. They offered her a position. She accepted and then spent 4 years learning that industry from the inside out, taking on projects that more cautious colleagues passed on, solving problems that more comfortable employees redirected upward. She built a reputation not for flash or self-promotion, but for the thing that is ultimately more durable than either of those, for getting things done correctly every time, regardless of the difficulty. She started her own firm 7 years after the night she walked out of the Voss household with her architecture textbooks and her 30 seconds of allowed grief. The firm was called Reyes Development Group. It specialized in exactly what her thesis had proposed: beautiful, functional, affordable residential communities in parts of the city that the bigger developers overlooked because the margins were thinner and the work was harder. The projects she built were not the flashiest properties in the city. They were the ones that lasted, the ones that communities actually needed. By the time the city's commercial property landscape began shifting significantly 3 years later, Reyes Development Group had become one of the most respected mid-sized firms in the region. Clara had 19 employees, 3 ongoing projects, and an offer on the table to lead the development of a major mixed-use complex on the eastern edge of the business district, the largest project the firm had ever taken on. She had spent 6 years becoming someone who deserved a seat at the table. She was now being invited to join. She was 36 years old. She was, by the most accurate and meaningful definition, successful. Not in the way Diana Voss was successful. Through inheritance and marriage, and the careful management of impressions. Through the much slower, much less glamorous, much more real method of building something from almost nothing and refusing to stop when the easier paths presented themselves. Diana Voss, meanwhile, had not been paying attention to any of this. She had no reason to. The world she occupied and the world Clara had been building did not intersect, as far as she knew. The Ashworth Group held their quarterly business luncheon at the Meridian Hotel downtown on the second Thursday of March. It was an invitation-only event for senior professionals in the city's property and development sector. Diana attended every year. It was exactly the kind of room she had always believed herself to belong in. Influential people, serious money, conversations that shaped what the city would look like in 20 years. She dressed with her usual precision. She arrived on time. She moved through the pre-lunch networking with the practiced ease of someone who has done this so often it has become as natural as breathing. She was at the drinks table, speaking to a man from a commercial leasing firm she had been trying to cultivate a connection with. When the room's energy shifted in that particular way rooms shift when someone of significant standing enters them. A ripple of recognition moved through the gathered professionals. Heads turned. Small clusters reformed themselves to orient toward the entrance. Diana glanced over. The woman who had entered was not dressed extravagantly. She wore a well-cut charcoal suit, her dark hair pulled back simply, a briefcase in one hand, and a quiet authority in the way she moved that had nothing to do with performance and everything to do with someone who is thoroughly comfortable with who she is. People reached out to greet her as she crossed the room, not the artificial warmth of a crowd greeting someone they want something from, the genuine warmth of people genuinely pleased to see someone they respect. Diana watched her cross the room and felt for the first time in a very long time something she did not immediately recognize because she so rarely experienced it. It took her a moment to identify it. It was the feeling of being on the wrong side of a room. Not socially, not professionally, something more fundamental. The feeling of having miscalculated something important long ago in a way that was only becoming clear now. The woman smiled and spoke briefly and warmly to the people she passed, and then she looked up and her eyes moved across the room with the easy scan of someone surveying a familiar landscape. Her gaze stopped. Diana's champagne glass paused at her lips. Clara Reyes looked at her former employer with an expression that was perfectly composed and entirely unreadable. Not cold, not warm, simply the face of a person encountering a piece of her past in an unexpected location and choosing, in real time, how to respond to it. She gave a small, measured nod, the professional acknowledgement of one adult recognizing another in a business setting, and continued across the room. Diana set her glass down with great care. She spent the next 15 minutes not listening to the man from the commercial leasing firm. At the lunch table, the seating arrangement placed Diana 4 seats from Clara, close enough to observe, far enough to feel the distance like a physical thing. She watched how Clara spoke with the people around her. She watched how they listened, not with the distracted half-attention of people performing engagement, but with the genuine focus of people who are learning something they find valuable. She watched a man she recognized as the head of one of the most significant property investment groups in the city lean forward and ask Clara a question, and wait for the answer with real interest. She thought about a crooked tray of shrimp appetizers. She thought about 40 guests watching a young woman in a maid's uniform place folded napkins on a table and walk away with her back straight. After lunch, as the room moved into the informal conversation portion of the event, Diana found herself across the standing table from Clara. Neither of them had maneuvered toward the other. They had simply arrived at the same location, as the layout of the room and the ordinary movement of 40 professionals sometimes produces. "Clara," Diana said. Her voice came out more carefully than she intended. "Mrs. Voss," Clara said, "it's good to see you." There was something in the response that was more unsettling than coldness would have been. It was genuine. Clara Reyes looked at the woman who had publicly humiliated her and fired her on a Friday evening and sounded for all the world as though she actually meant what she said. Diana glanced at Clara's name card on the table. "Director, Reyes Development Group. You've done extremely well for yourself," she said. It was the sentence she had prepared during the meal, and it sounded out loud exactly as insufficient as she had feared it would. "Thank you," Clara said simply. It took time. A brief silence. The room moved around them. Diana took a breath and did something she had done very rarely in her adult life. She set down the careful management of her own image and tried to simply be honest. "I owe you an apology," she said, "for the way I handled things at my home. Years ago, I was unkind. I was unnecessarily public about it, and I've thought about it more than you probably expect." Clara looked at her with the same composed attention she gave to everything. She didn't rush to fill the silence with reassurance. She let the words exist in the space where they had been placed. "I appreciate you saying that," she finally said. "I mean that." "I was wrong," Diana said. "Yes," Clara said. Not harshly, just truthfully. "You were." Another silence. Then something shifted slightly in Clara's expression. Not softening, exactly, but opening a fraction, the way a door opens when someone on the other side stops pushing against it. "Can I tell you something honestly?" Diana nodded. "That night changed my life," Clara said. "Not because of what you did to me, but because of how I chose to respond to it. I went back to university. I built my firm. Every single hard day in between, I made a decision about who I was going to be when I came out the other side." She looked at Diana steadily. "You didn't give me that. I gave myself that. But sometimes being pushed into the cold is the thing that makes you find out how warm you can burn on your own." Diana felt something shift behind her ribs. Something uncomfortable and necessary, the way it feels when something that has been locked for a long time is finally opened. "I'm glad you built what you built," Diana said. "I mean it." "I know you do," Clara said. "I can tell." She paused, and then the quiet authority in her face gave way briefly to something that was almost a smile. Not triumphant, not forgiving in the false way that erases what was done, but real and grounded and human. "The world is a small place, Mrs. Voss. The people you see on the way up are very often the people you see again." She picked up her briefcase. She had somewhere to be. She had always had somewhere to be. 3 weeks later, Diana received a call from the Ashworth Group regarding a potential collaboration between their investment arm and a mid-sized development firm they were considering bringing into a major project. The firm they were considering was Reyes Development Group. The investment firm handling Diana's portfolio held a 20% stake in the Ashworth Group. Diana was not Clara's boss, but she was, effectively and precisely, one of the stakeholders whose approval the Reyes Development Group would need to proceed. The roles had not simply reversed. Something more interesting had happened. They had become, in the complicated topology of the city's business world, peers. Peers with a history. Peers with a conversation between them that had not been fully finished. Diana sat with the proposal for 2 days before she called the Ashworth Group with her response. She read everything Clara's firm had built. She read the project histories, the community impact reports, the architectural plans that had been executed with a precision and thoughtfulness that made the work of much larger firms look careless by comparison. She read the thesis from Clara's university graduation, which someone at Ashworth had included in the briefing package, and she read it carefully, the way you read something when you're trying to understand a person rather than evaluate a property. Then she picked up the phone. "I'd like to schedule a direct conversation with Miss Reyes," she told the contact at Ashworth, "not through intermediaries. I want to sit across the table from her and hear the vision for this project in her own words." They met in a conference room on the 14th floor of a building that had been built 20 years ago by a firm that no longer existed. Clara laid out the plans with the same unhurried competence that characterized everything she did. She answered Diana's questions directly. She acknowledged the challenges the project presented without minimizing them and proposed specific, well-considered solutions for each one. Diana noticed across the table that Clara did not change her manner for her. She spoke to Diana exactly as she spoke to the other people in the room. With respect, with clarity, without the slight tonal adjustment most people made when speaking to someone they were hoping to impress or needed something from. It was, Diana recognized, the way you spoke when you had nothing to prove. When you had already proven it, in rooms like this one, over years of work that was now sitting in a folder on the table between you. Diana asked one question that wasn't on the briefing materials. "Why this neighborhood?" Clara looked up from the plans. "Because it's the kind of neighborhood I grew up in. Because the people there deserve the same quality of construction and design as anyone else. And because no one else is doing it." There was no performance in the answer, no calculation. It was simply the truth, stated by a person who had long since stopped seeing any reason to dress the truth up in something more strategic. Diana looked at the plans for a long moment. She looked at the budget projections and the community impact modeling and the architectural drawings that showed, in careful and elegant detail, what this part of the city could become if someone chose to take it seriously. She looked at all of it and understood, with the particular clarity that comes from a very long time of not looking at something honestly, exactly what she was in the presence of. Then she nodded. "You have my support," she said. The development broke ground 6 months later. It was, by every measure, a success. Under budget, ahead of schedule, and built to a standard that drew attention from firms and city planners who had previously overlooked that part of the city entirely. Clara gave an interview to an architecture journal in which she described her approach to the project in careful, technical detail. The journalist asked at the end if there was a single moment or person that she credited with shaping her drive. Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "There was a night years ago when someone told me very clearly and very publicly that my work wasn't good enough. I decided that night what I was going to do about that." She looked at the journalist with her characteristic steadiness. "I've been grateful for that night ever since." The journalist asked who the person was. "Someone who taught me," Clara said, "that how you're treated by others is their character. How you respond to it is yours." Diana read the interview in the waiting room of her accountant's office on a Thursday morning. She read that last line twice. Then she folded the magazine carefully and set it on the table beside her. And when her accountant came to call her in, she was sitting very still, looking at nothing in particular, with an expression that was difficult to read and unmistakably genuine. She thought about a young woman placing a stack of folded napkins on a table with careful hands. She thought about the straightness of Clara's back as she walked away. She thought about how clearly she had communicated, in front of 40 people, that this young woman was worth nothing, and how that young woman had taken that communication and done something with it that Diana had never done with any of the advantages she had been handed across a lifetime. She sat in the waiting room for several minutes after her accountant's assistant called her name a second time. She was doing something she did not often do. She was sitting with something uncomfortable without immediately trying to resolve it or manage it or redirect it into something more flattering to herself. She was simply letting it be true. Because some lessons cannot be purchased. They cannot be inherited. They cannot be acquired through any of the careful social maneuvers that Diana Voss had spent a lifetime perfecting. They come only one way, through the long, patient education of living with what you have done and meeting years later, the evidence of what it meant. Meeting it with your eyes open and your performances set aside and no one in the room to perform for. They come the way all real things come, slowly, honestly, and at a cost angst you feel in your chest long after the moment has passed. We don't always get to choose the rooms we start in, but we choose in ways both large and barely visible, the kind of person we become inside them. We choose how we speak to the person across the table who has less power than us at this particular moment. We choose whether our cruelty is loud or quiet. We choose whether our decency is real or curated. And those choices do not disappear. They accumulate. They follow us into conference rooms and luncheons and chance encounters in hotel lobbies. And they wait there, patient as time, for the moment when we have to look at what we actually are. Because the maid you fired in front of 40 guests is working on something, even when you're not watching. The person you dismissed on your way up is taking notes. And the world, small and interconnected and indifferent to your self-image, has a long and reliable memory. Where are you watching from today? Leave your city in the comments below. New York, Chicago, Atlanta, Houston, Miami, or perhaps London, Sydney, Cape Town, Dubai, Nairobi, Mumbai, Toronto, or Singapore. We want to know how far this story has traveled and whose heart it has found along the way. What moment in this story stayed with you? Tell us in the comments. Maybe you've been Clara, dismissed by someone who misjudged you completely. Maybe you've been Diana, and you know it. Either way, this story belongs to you. Like this video if it made you think about how you treat the people who serve you, clean for you, work beneath you in the rooms of your life. Share it with someone who needs to be reminded that position is temporary and character is permanent. Subscribe so you never miss a story that tells the truth. Thank you for watching until the end. That says something about you. It says you're the kind of person who stays for the whole story. And those are exactly the kind of people the world needs more of.